This is my promise to you. If the Bills win the Super Bowl, I will go through a folding table for this channel. Hello friendos, this is Chain, welcoming you back to Chain of Commander. Last week, Bretagard Stronghold was spoiled as one of the new lands coming from the upcoming Kaldheim set. And this card really focused around 1/1 counters and giving things abilities. So that got me thinking here. What are some other cool lands that we can utilize when building a +1/+1 counter deck? Well, I figured for this month's visit to the base of operations, we can go over just that thing. Now, this is not designed to be a comprehensive list by any stretch of the imagination. So if there's any lands I missed or any lands or other, just even other cards that you think would be super cool for inclusion in a +1/+1 counter deck, definitely put them in the comments below. Love to hear it. I personally have a +1/+1 counter deck. So if there's anything you can give me to kind of make it even spicier, I'd love to know. Comment below. I'll check them all out. That said, let's get into this here. Let's start with the Bretagard Stronghold itself. Now, Bretagard Stronghold is an uncommon land from Kaldheim. It enters the battlefield tapped. It can produce green mana, and it has the activated ability of green, white, white, tap, and sack it. Put a counter on up to 2 target creatures you control. They get lifelink and vigilance until end of turn. Now, this effect is actually pretty strong, and especially in a limited environment, that's going to be a pretty powerful late game trick to both get a little bit of extra damage in, or maybe gain a little bit of life if you really need it. Especially in our format, it's a single land that you can utilize to kind of take advantage or get that same effect, especially if you're getting low in life in the late game and you just need a little bit extra more. Or if you have any life gain triggers you need to take advantage, like if you have Archangel of Thune, where you can then use the life gain to put some counters on things, that can be taken advantage of as well. That said, it is a pretty mana intensive effect, costing you essentially 4 mana because you need to tap this land to do it, as well as the additional green, white, white, and you need to sacrifice the land to get it. That is actually a pretty huge cost for the effect, and while it's got the right idea, Magic has such a depth of cards to choose from that I am sure there are other lands that might be able to do something like this, but a little bit better. So let's see what else we got. Now, one of the lands I'm looking at here is Idyllic Range from Throne of Eldraine. This is a land, plains. It enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 3 or more other planes, and if it enters the battlefield untapped, you get to put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control. So, like the Stronghold, this has the potential to enter the battlefield tapped, while the Stronghold will always tap, but this one also has the chance to not enter the battlefield tapped, and if it doesn't enter the battlefield tapped, you get the bonus out of it. Now, this requires you to have multiple planes out there, but if you're playing a single color deck, or even a dual color deck, just maybe green, white, or something like that, or even if it's a 3 color deck with the heavy white skew, having 3 other planes is not even that much of a challenge to achieve. You're very likely going to have that just over the course of the game. So this could, for all intents and purposes, be a free inclusion in your deck. And getting a free 1/1 counter for virtually no cost is a great bonus. And it has the plains subtype here. So this is fetchable with fetch lands or things like Knight of the Orchid, of the White Orchid, to go get. So if you want to kind of treat it as maybe a combat trick, you can fetch this in the middle of combat. If you have a fetch land, give a creature +1/+1 counter and surprise your opponents that way. That said, the effect is essentially pretty low impact. Just a single extra bit of power over the course of the whole game might not really mean too much. And it's essentially, I feel like we can do better. So what other things do we have that can be even better than this? A lot. But let's move on. Now, the next card we have here is Laniwar Reborn. That does a kind of a similar thing to Idyllic Range in the fact that it can give one of our creatures a single +1/+1 counter. It enters the battlefield tapped, it produces green mana, and it has Graft 1. Now, Graft 1 means that it enters the battlefield with a ++1 counter on it, and then whenever a subsequent creature enters the battlefield under our control, we can choose to move that +1/+1 counter to it. But because of this particular graph mechanic versus just putting the counter directly on the creature, that means there are ways we can take advantage of this, and that is with proliferate style effects. If we have a card out there like Evolution Stage, which proliferates whenever land enters the battlefield under our control, we can play Laniwar Reborn. It will enter with the +1/+1 counter on it, so that when the Resolution Stage trigger finally resolved, we can then proliferate that counter, giving it 2 counters on it. So we can start stockpiling +1/+1 counters on this land for future creatures entering the battlefield. Now, regardless of how many counters are on Laniwar Reborn, you can still only move one of them at a time. So if you're staying ahead on lands, ahead of how many creatures are entering the battlefield, you can have a +1/+1 counter on every creature coming in. That said, I'm certain we can do better than this. But before we keep going, if you're liking what I'm going on so far, definitely consider hitting that like button. I'd love to see it. But let's move on to some better options. The next card we have here is Novagin, Heart of Progress, which, despite the name, isn't actually a legendary land. Regardless, it doesn't matter in our format, but this is the first card on our list to not enter tapped. It will come in untapped, and that's great. It's also the first one on our list to have a repeatable ability on it. But the trade-off in this situation is that it does not produce colored mana, it produces colorless mana. We're going to see going forward that seems to be the trade-off that gets made in a lot of these cards. Either they produce colorless mana or they enter tapped. So you'll need to make sure when building your deck to keep both of those in mind as far as trade-offs. That said, the ability on this thing is absolutely fantastic. For green, blue, and tap, you can put a +1/+1 creature or counter on every creature that's entered the battlefield this turn. That includes tokens. So if you just make a bunch of tokens or are able to drop a bunch of tiny little creatures, you can all make them a little bit bigger for just essentially 3 mana. And that can represent 2 to 3 power each and every turn if you can plan your turns accordingly. However, that blue in the activation cost there, that can be a bit restrictive. A lot of +1/+1 counter synergies revolve around green-white or maybe even green-white-black, so Abzan. But this won't fit in those decks. So what do we have in terms of maybe an effect like this that does fit in those decks? Well, I'll get to the point. We have Oran, Reef, the Vastwood. This is a land that enters the battlefield tapped, but produces green. Like I said, you're normally choosing one or the other there. And it has the ability to tap, put a +1/+1 counter on each green creature that entered the battlefield this turn. This one is actually a little bit spicier because, first, it's only each green creature, and second, it's everybody's green creature. So if somehow your opponents manage to get some green creatures in the battlefield on this turn when you activate this, they're also going to get +1/+1 counters. But this is really starting to enter the good stuff because even though it enters the battlefield tapped and has a very similar effect to Novagin, Heart of Progress, the activation cost of it is essentially free. You only need to tap this card to get it, which means instead of investing for Novagin 3 mana into getting the effect, you only need to invest 1 mana into the effect. And it, once again, like Novagin, this does not care if the creature's a token. So if you're able to produce a bunch of things, like if you're playing Dwarven Elf Ball and just getting a bunch of elves, or that new Lathril Blade of Elves deck that's coming out shortly, this thing will be able to pump a lot of power on the board. This could be representing 5, 6, 7 power every turn if you can really get your elves flowing. So the benefit of this card can provide for +1/+1 strategies is just absolutely fantastic, especially since the only real drawback for it is that it enters the battlefield tapped. But that's not all we have. There are more lands we can really put in these +1/+1 counter decks. So what else do we got? Now here we have Gavin Township. Gavin Township does not care who you are, where you're from, what you did. As long as you pay the 2 green, white, and tap it, it will give all of your creatures a +1/+1 counter. Unlike the previously mentioned lands that only affect creatures that enter the battlefield under your control of that turn, this affects all of your creatures, and you can do it at instant speed. This represents so much power on board. It is a instant speed combat trick. It could turn even your tiniest mana dork into a big threat over the course of the game if you start activating it or have the ability to activate it every turn. And you know, it is such a nice effect that Wizards was nice enough to put it on another card that can fit into this color combination, Shalai Voice of Plenty. So albeit that one a little bit more expensive, it does have the same ability if you were looking for a little bit of redundancy. It's also the coziest looking building I've ever seen on a Magic card. It looks like a nice Victorian era inn, and I would love to stay there. Now, like Gavin Township, I also don't care who you are, where you're from, or what you did. I'm more than willing to have you folks join us going forward for this channel. Definitely consider subscribing below. I'd love to have you folks hanging out with us and joining us, and check out our Discord as well. That said, I'm trying to think. I think we're just missing one more card here. And what was that thing? That's right. It was Karn's Bastian. This is land that can add colorless to your mana pool and has the ability of 4 tap. You get a proliferate. As I was mentioning it earlier with Laniwar Reborn, proliferate is a way that we kind of take advantage of lands with +1/+1s on the battlefield, but it also can affect our creatures that have +1/+1 on them already. Now, obviously, this doesn't put the counters on them. The counter already has to exist there to get an additional one, so you can't start from scratch with this one. But it does take an already developed +1/+1 counter board and make it a little bit beefier. And because it's proliferate, you can also affect planeswalkers you control. If you're playing a +1/+1 counter deck, there's a decent chance you're playing things like Ajani the Greathearted or Nissa, Voice of Zendikar, both of which are absolutely great cards for those sort of decks. So you can also slowly uptick those to get their abilities to add +1/+1 counters to everything as well. So, Karn's Bastian, while not explicitly a +1/+1 counter deck kind of card, is an excellent inclusion in those sort of decks anyways. It synergizes with your deck, it synergizes with your game plan, and it suits it pretty well. There you go. So those were just some of the cards I would toss around out there if I was designing a +1/+1 counter deck. Based off of this, obviously it looks like green-white would probably be your best color combination base, with the ability to maybe splash blue or some other colors of your choice to really get access to as much about the +1/+1 counters as you would like. That said, like I said, if I missed anything, just put them in the comments below. Let me hear it. Let me sound off. I am not the greatest deck builder in the world. I don't know every single Magic card, but you might. So let me know if I missed anything. Beyond that, thank you very much for joining me today. I'll see you guys later this week. And lastly, go Bills.